Welcome to Conversations with the Pastor, the hippest show in the Pacific Northwest, where we talk about current events and things that matter to you. We're here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Now listen, this is an interactive conversation. That means we need you to ask questions via Facebook or pastorconversations@thenbcf.org. Don't miss out. Now let's start the conversation. Pastor?
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Conversations with the Pastor. And yes, that's right, conversation, which means you've got to talk back to me, let those fingers fly across that keyboard and send in your questions so that you can become a part of shaping this dialogue here today. Before I introduce my two incredible guests that I have for this evening, I want to start off with some things that make you go, Today, the new Speaker of the House, Mr. Michael Johnson, he said that Republicans don't have to do anything on immigration. They can just walk away, and that to accept any number other than zero in terms of people coming across the border in terms of immigration is a surrender. Zero. The problem is Mr. Johnson should do his homework before he opens his mouth. My grandfather used to say, it's one thing for people to think you a fool, it's another thing for you to open your mouth and leave no doubt. The number has never been zero. As a matter of fact, and there is a fact basis that should be established in all conversations. Yes, Google it, facts, they still exist, fact. The Labor Department will tell you the United States needs a minimum of 225 fresh immigrants every year or our economy will collapse. In particular is dependent upon it the agricultural sector, the housing sector, the domestic and human services sector is particularly dependent upon low-skilled, semi-skilled labor. In addition, for the past 20 years, we have been steadily increasing the number of special visas to bring engineers from other countries because the American educational system is not producing the amount of engineers that our economy demands in our high-tech, digitally based economy. Notice when Trump became president of the United States, and his first order of business was to put together his infamous a Muslim ban, and it was quickly pushed back on by the Amazons and the Apples and the Googles and the Microsofts. Why? Because that means that the engineers that they critically need as the engine of their industry, we're not producing them enough in terms of our own educational system in the United States, which is something that we need to address. So when we start thinking about immigration, the goal cannot be shut down the border using Hitlerish language that they're poisoning the blood of the nation. This is a nation of immigrants, voluntarily and forced, as in the case of African Americans. Unless you are descendants of Navajo and Apache and Cherokee and Duwamish and Seminole and Seneca and on, you are descendants of immigrants. And so the question becomes, when you have a 1,000-mile border along the southern United States and as well along the northern United States, although ironically they very rarely complain about immigrants coming from the northern border. I'll let you decode that yourself on the way home. But with a 1,000-mile border, it is impossible and impractical to build a 1,000-mile fence, plus the fact that most of the immigrants are coming along legal ports of entry, which would make a fence irrelevant. And because people would already dig tunnels underneath it or catapult over it, it's more of a symbolic move. It is the muscle flexing of somebody who does not understand that in today's political world, the proper answers are probably nuanced answers. Some things are not as simple as some simple people think. I recall George Bush saying amidst the Desert Storm War when he conflated Iraq with the problems that came through Saudi Arabians, 16 Saudi Arabians with box cutters that changed the world, and conflated 9/11 with Saddam Hussein. And he said, either they are for us or against us. No, the world is not black or white. There is black, there is white, but in between there's a whole lot of shades of gray. And intelligent people know that in a world of many varied and conflicting interests, usually the right answer is a nuanced answer that is fluent, not once and for all. Intelligent people understand that. People who know what their values are, their interests may change, their values remain the same, their partnerships may flip from time to time, and they hold each other accountable according to the underlying values. Yes, America has a very complicated immigration challenge. Most of it is rooted in regional insecurity. The people who are coming to our border in the South are like those who once came on ships from Europe. Give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses longing to breathe free. Send us these, the wretched refuge of your teeming shores, and I will light a candle by the golden door. Those people were running from potato blights and tyranny and poverty and so forth in Europe. And now people are doing along the southern border and in other places in the world what people have always done: flee poverty, flee persecution, flee oppression, flee abuse, famine and flood, just to survive and to have a chance at a better life. Can everybody come to this one country? Of course, the answer to that in the abstract is no. But do we need people to come? Yes, because our native population has a net minus every year. And therefore, we need immigrants in this country for our economy. But we have to do it in an orderly way without being undergirded by the fear of some people that their privilege that was established in all the immoral and ungodly ways is a threat to the blackening and the browning and the yellowing and the redding of American society. We get what's underneath it. People have learned to speak the most racist things without mentioning race. So we decode, we digest, we decipher. And so we challenge the Speaker of the House and others who were elected and appointed to legislate and bring forth legislation that's for the good of the nation. For all, do your job, solve the problem, listen and heed the biblical language. Come, let us reason together. We still need reasonable people who do not agree on everything, but they realize compromise is the only way diverse people of different backgrounds, different interests, but who all have a common need to see the nation survive and the democracy survive. We have to come together. Nobody will ever get all of what they want. I often say to the people here in my church, we can very rarely offer you an ideal solution, but almost always we can offer you an adequate solution. Mature people understand the way forward together is adequate. And so with that, think about it. We'll get back to you. And now I want to switch gears here and introduce our august, illustrious, wonderful, magnificent guests for this evening to talk to us about one of the most salient issues of our time, an issue for the ages, but one of the most salient for our current age. And I want to introduce to you here on set Dr. Alice Rothschild, and remotely here with us Sabrina O'Day, both of whom were with us just several weeks ago in the beginning of the holiday seasons, and they are now back with us as we talk about what is going on in Palestine, Israel, the war between the Israeli government and Hamas, the people of Palestine. And we're going to talk about all the issues connected with that. But let me just say, good evening, ladies.
Good evening.
Sabrina? Hello. Let's not assume that all my audience knows the both of you, so I'm going to do what I do every week and allow everyone to give their quick hurry up, no huddle introduction of themselves. And excuse the sports metaphor, but I was in Buffalo the 4 years they went to the Super Bowl, lost every year, but they used to run the K-gun. It was, instead of huddling, they did the hurry up, no huddle. So those of you who understand football, you understand the analogy. But I'm gonna start with Dr. Rothschild. Would you tell the people, who is Alice Rothschild?
Well, I first have to say I know nothing about football, so so I am a retired obstetrician gynecologist and an author of a number of books, and a filmmaker and a social activist. And I have focused my attention on Israel-Palestine for the past 25 years, going to the region almost every year since 2004, except for the pandemic. I was last there in August. I was in Gaza. I was in the West Bank and Israel. And I have an immense interest and understanding of this issue.
All righty. Sabrina?
Yeah, I hate intros, but I'll try to get a swing at it. So, my name is Sabrina Oda, a Palestinian born and raised here in Seattle. I come from a background in cultural studies. I have my master's in cultural studies and bachelor's in society ethics and human behavior. So very much a human rights centered academic background. My lived experience is that I'm a daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees. In my 9 to 5, I'm an advocate for survivors of human trafficking. So you can say I pretty much eat, breathe, and sleep human rights.
All right. Well, the two of you cover a lot of ground, from a physician, filmmaker. Very rarely does someone's bona fides include filmmaker, gynecologist. So that in itself begs for a whole lot of conversation. You're both left brain and right brain. Most of us live life having lost half our mind. You've got your whole mind.
I'm losing all of my mind.
And Sabrina, with the work you're doing in human trafficking, which we know sadly, ironically, in 21st century is probably at higher levels than it's ever been before. As the world becomes smarter, it becomes more demonic all at the same time, ironically. As Martin King once said, that our technological advance, our moral advance has not kept pace with it. But those are messages for another day. Of all the shows that we have done in the few years we've been doing Conversations with the Pastor, I don't think there's one where there's been a greater reaction to, very favorable reaction. My phone, my email, the church's website, blown up with people saying, bring them back. Because at the end of the show, you guys promised you would come back, and folks like, bring them back. We just scratched the surface. We want to understand more. There are people out there who really do want to understand better so they know how to weigh in on the issue. They want the language, they want the background. And the show just began to feed the issue. My wife beat me up pretty bad. Bring them ladies back. Forget about that other stuff. Bring them back. So let's start from both of you kind of giving us your assessment of where are we these 100+ days now into this quote unquote Israel-Hamas war. What's your assessment, each of you respectively? What is your assessment of where we are and what is going on, maybe beyond what the media is saying to us? And I'm not into the fake news, bash the media as most dictators do so that they become people's sole source of info. No, I believe in the free press and all of that, but I know you guys have a behind the scenes peek into things. Dr. Rothschild, what is your assessment of where we are?
So I work with Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council, and every week I curate an update on the health and human rights status in Gaza. And so at this moment, what I can say is that the healthcare system has almost completely collapsed, that something like 90% of the population are now internally displaced within Gaza, which is a small place, 28 miles by 6 miles. So almost the entire population is living in shelters provided by the UN, the UNRWA, or living crowded together in family homes, or living in tents, or living in rubble. I mean, just horrific, horrific conditions. We have It's over 26,000 people have been killed. 10 kids every day are losing one or both limbs. The number of injured is now way over 60,000. The amount of infectious disease and diseases related to trauma and amputations and that kind of thing is skyrocketing, and the healthcare system is barely able to function. There's been a complete lack of electricity since October 7th. So any electricity people have is related to generators so they require fuel, and there's been almost no fuel. So the humanitarian situation is beyond catastrophic. It's just immorally appalling. And populations keep being told, leave the north, go south, go east, go west, and then people literally get bombed on the way to where they've been told is safe, or they get to a, quote, safe place, and there are no services, and then they get bombed in their safe place. So it's just a catastrophe. I have many colleagues there that I'm in touch with or aware of their status. I work with a group called We Are Not Numbers, which is a group that mentors young people in Gaza. So we're hearing bits and pieces from them. Most of them are really unable to write at this point. They don't have electricity or working phones, and they're often just so traumatized that putting words on paper is way beyond what they can do, but they send small texts and that kind of thing. So I'm very much in touch with the on-the-ground reality, and it is just appalling. And we hear rumbles about another ceasefire potentially, but I'm not going to believe it till I see it. There's a lot of language coming out of the Israeli government that is horrifically racist and just genocidal in content and in intent. And as you may know, the International Court of Justice received a claim from South Africa claiming genocide, and there are also a number of Palestinians in the U.S., along with Al-Haq and Defense of Children International Palestine, that are suing the Biden administration for not preventing genocide. So things are pretty catastrophic.
Sabrina?
I mean, I really don't know what to add. I'm sorry. Dr. Alice Rashad, you went through, I think, the most efficient summary I've heard, at least in the last few weeks. So I'm sorry to say that I don't have anything to add, but I think that was a really good summary. I would just say, I think you touched on this a little bit with the trauma, but I think that the morale is really at an all-time low. I think maybe the ICJ ruling was something that people were kind of looking forward to. Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in diaspora, were really hoping that there would be some type of accountability that would happen from that ruling. And yeah, I think it was a bit of a disappointment, but not shocking. So anyways, I think that there's a good summary there to start with.
I also think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the ICJ ruling. They said South Africa has standing to bring this, that genocide may be happening, but they have to study it, and that they urged Israel to stop genocidal policies, implying that that's what they're doing, and they're supposed to report back in a month. So there's some movement here. I think we should not be totally disappointed in them, but there were little glimmers that this might move in a positive direction, or horrific negative positive direction.
Yeah, I think the Palestinian community as a whole is pretty split on the ICJ ruling. I think I've heard a lot of kind of sentiment on like, this is historic, this is huge, there's, finally we can have the conversation about, Israel being held accountable for genocide, or occupation, war crimes, all of the things in general. But on the flip side of that, I think the disappointment that exists is how much more destruction needs to be seen or brought to the table. I think South Africa was very forthcoming with the atrocities that we've all really seen to kind of prove the point that a genocide is happening. And so, yeah, I think maybe just something a little bit stronger from the ICJ was at least the other half of the Palestinian community. I think that's what they were hoping for, something that would at least call for an immediate ceasefire. I think also, like, there are legal proceedings that, we have to just wait for. They take a long time. So, yeah, I think there's a lot going on in that scenario. But, yeah, it's been pretty split down the middle in the Palestinian.
The other thing about the call for a ceasefire, which is what we absolutely need, is that the ICJ negotiates between state actors. And so there is talk that they could tell Israel to stop bombing, but since Hamas isn't a state actor, that they don't have standing to do that. So I'm sure there are other legal questions that make this even more complicated.
I listened to the conversation on Capitol Hill where they're discussing aid packages tied to Ukraine and the border and Israel. And one of the things I always conjure in my mind as I watch this atrocity that you summarized so very well, Dr. Rothschild, is giving Israel more aid to do what and to whom? And versus I haven't heard any conversation about us allocating aid to the Palestinian people. Now, you can't, the old saying says Rome wasn't built in a day. And so if it lay in rubble and in ruin, it certainly can't be rebuilt in a day. So I'm thinking if we had a magic wand, the war stopped tomorrow. And there was some lasting peace that folks agreed to, some reallocation of lands, and all those issues were resolved. The question that I would have is, what is the Marshall Plan to rebuild Gaza, the West Bank, areas like that prior to October 7th, that were already some of the worst areas in the world? Biggest open air prison, I think some people have referred to it, with people stacked on top of folks. One of the lowest life expectancies, highest infant mortality rates. And so what is the plan to remove the rubble, to rebuild? International law says you break it, you have to fix it. So we have laid this nation in ruins. Where are these people going to go while it's being rebuilt? Who's going to foot the bill? Because if there is no answer to that, they will die immediately because of the war, or slowly, more insidiously because of disease, infection. Those who survive, you will raise up another generation of people who hate Israel and hate the United States and everyone they feel is their sponsors. So there's going to be more ill will. So I guess what I'm asking is, in all of this, what are your thoughts about this whole sense of the United States sending more aid to Israel for what?
Should I start?
Yes.
So unfortunately, the United States is sending Israel military aid. So they're sending aid that is going to be used to continue bombing Gaza, destroying the remaining institutions that exist. They've already destroyed all the universities, the libraries, a lot of the cultural sites.
Can I stop right there? Let me ask you this question. In my opinion, because we went through Desert Storm and so forth, we say we're going to get rid of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda exists today. It's hard to get rid of an idea and even a political group. And certainly if you think they're functioning in a hospital, all you got to do is send in some intelligence workers and so forth. You don't have to blow up the hospital. It appears to me that they're simply destroying civilian infrastructure to make it uninhabitable for a population, to depopulate it of Palestinians so that they can later be replaced with Jewish settlements. Am I incorrect in that? Am I reading it wrong?
I think you're correct. If you listen to what the most right-wing people in the government are saying, they actually had a conference last week with thousands of people attending to plan the repopulation of Gaza with Jewish settlements, settlers. And so, when we think about a Marshall Plan for this region, we don't know where the end point is going to be. Is the Israeli military going to drive the entire population to the southern Rafah border, and people will, in desperation, crash through the gates and end up in big tents cities in the Sinai? Will people be allowed to stay? Will people be only allowed to stay in the south and not in the north? I mean, there's some massively big unknowns that can't be jumped over when we're thinking about the Marshall Plan. And Israel has a long history of not believing in the you break it, you fix it. So it will be expected that the entire international community come in and fix it. But I don't know what it is right now. Clearly in the short term, people are starving to death. People are dying of infection. People are dying because there's no blood supply. There's some immediate, absolutely must happen right immediately now kind of things. But long term, it's much harder to know because we don't know what we're dealing with. And, you kind of hopped over, well, when the land gets figured out and blah, blah, blah. Those are the big questions.
Yes.
Before we can imagine what the rehabilitation is going to be like. And there's a huge amount of mental trauma, obviously.
Yes. Sabrina, did you want to say anything at this point?
Yeah. I wanted to talk actually about one of the points that you had just brought up about, I don't know if what Israel could do better. There's really nothing, there's no justification for what they're doing or how they're doing it. And there's no better, right? I think their agenda is pretty clear at this point, over 100 days in, what their goal is. And I think you hit the nail on the head with what their goal is. For not the siege in Gaza, but the genocide on Gaza at this point. But what I wanted to point out was you brought up kind of an interesting point, and I don't know if it's because you saw a video recently, but Israel is very, very well versed in sending folks to infiltrate, Israeli soldiers to infiltrate hospitals specifically. Different institutions, not just hospitals, but a video was just released a few days ago of an attack that was taking place at a hospital in the West Bank in Jenin, where Israeli soldiers, men, were dressed as women and dressed as Palestinians, speaking Arabic, to kill Palestinians. They killed 3 young Palestinian men during that raid. I'm not sure how many were injured, unfortunately, but these are just different ways in which Israel proves that they are not, if they wanted to go in and try to find Hamas, for example, they could do it in the ways that they do it in the West Bank, but they're not. Their whole goal is collective punishment. Their goal is to eradicate Gaza of the Palestinian people. To build, this isn't the conference was held a week ago, but in October and in November, there were plans released and different, it was almost like jokes that were being released from Israeli media and different Israeli influencers of a theme park that they were going to build in Gaza once they flattened it and got rid of all the Palestinians. So this isn't really necessarily anything new, but I think, again, now it's just being really brought to light how insidious the agenda is.
It is very clear to me as I sit here and watch it as an American citizen, knowing that we are a very biased broker in this. But as an American who has an African American perspective, as a people who were completely objectified within the American narrative, and therefore I look at every situation through the lens of a people who were deprived of the rights that are supposed to be unalienable. A people who have been thingified, itified, objectified. It is very clear to me that the American public has been desensitized to any sense of humanity of the Palestinians, any sense that the Palestinians have any rights that have to be acknowledged. It's almost like a version of the Dred Scott decision, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in the United States, where the Supreme Court ruled that black people had no rights, that white people were obligated anywhere at any time to acknowledge it. So when you look at the atrocities inflicted on the civilian population, which violates every standard of international law, things that the United States, the American public is outraged at normally. We're outraged when we see it in the Ukraine. We're outraged when we saw the strong man Milosevic. We were outraged at what we said Saddam Hussein was doing. We've outraged when we've seen South American dictators. But now we're comfortable the Palestinian people are objects to the American public because of either religious notions or what have you. It's the sense that they're just numbers. They're similar to the rhetoric, if you read American history, in the Indian removal acts, that we had a Native American problem, that Israel has a Palestinian problem.
And racism towards Palestinians is the last acceptable racism in our country.
But it's a racism that's acceptable in this country, too.
In this country, yes.
Yes, it's very racist. Because there's not the sense that the conversations about what should happen is clearly undergirded with the sense that these people aren't entitled to anything, and that the Jewish people there are entitled to everything. And as an African American, my people have been on the downside of that conversation. Yes.
I just wanted to say something that you mentioned about America being, how did you say it, an unequal broker in this situation?
Yes.
How you said it? When I think of like a broker or someone who comes in to mediate a situation, I would think of someone who's objective. I would think of someone who has some ground to stand on. I would think of someone who hasn't necessarily done the same thing to another group of people. The idea that America has any room, any like ground to stand on in this is absolutely obscene to me. I think we don't even have to take it back hundreds of years, but from the inception of the United States, the U.S. has always operated in a similar way that Israel is operating, in oppressing, marginalizing, objectifying, however you want to, say it. They have always done that to groups of people, and always made sure that there were all of the isms existed within society. That has not changed in the US, it's just changed in the methods. So the fact that the US can sit here and tell other people how to govern in a way that is fair, or talk about the only democracy in the world. Here in the US, we have our own problems here in the US. Like, we don't have to get into that. I can come back to talk about that another day. But the U.S. should not be involved. And if you want to take it a step further and say, look at what they did to the rest of the Middle East. Look at the destruction they caused in Iraq. That's not that long ago. Mm-hmm. Look at what they did to Afghanistan. That's not that long ago, right? And these are folks, like, unfortunately, when you're looking at, you're talking about public perception, these are people that look like us. These are people that look like Palestinians. So unfortunately, when you villainize a people, when you villainize Arabs as a whole, it doesn't matter that this is happening to Palestinians by Israel. We are now a monolith. Arabs are villains, right? And we have been for a very long time. This isn't something that's new here in the US. So it is quite unfortunate, but when I hear things like UNRWA funding is cut off by the US, and then you look at the countries in which cut off UNRWA funding, they are all Western, for the most part, colonizing countries. So I just think that oftentimes we don't put enough emphasis on the fact that history really is repeating itself, just in different ways and to a different group of people. Sometimes to the same group of people. In the Palestinians' case, it's happened to us quite a bit at this point. But yeah, I think that we really need to have an open and honest conversation about who is allowing this to happen outside of just the Israeli government.
Let me ask you these two questions, both of you, and you can drill down however deep you want to or need to. Number one, if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, what would be the objectives of the ceasefire? What would need to be accomplished in the ceasefire from your perspective? Number two, if you had a magic wand and could affect a just and righteous outcome in Palestine, Israel, what would it look like? That's the big picture stuff you were talking about a few moments ago. Because what are we working toward? What is the vision of the future? So yes, what needs to be accomplished in a ceasefire? But number two, what should we be working toward as a just and righteous outcome, big picture of the situation in Palestine and Israel?
So I think when we're talking about a ceasefire, there's the short-term outcome and there's the long-term. So in the short term, a ceasefire has to then be immediately followed by massive, massive, massive amounts of humanitarian aid. I mean, as I said, people are starving in Gaza. People are dying. If you think about all the people who have chronic diseases, none of them have had any health care for the last 3 months. And then you add all of the injured on top of that. Medically, it's a catastrophe. So,
well, let me ask you on that, because it was a very densely populated place to begin with. Now you got mounds of rubble. Spatially speaking, where are all these people in a ceasefire? Where do you put them to even give them that aid? Where will the bodies sleep?
Right.
Where are the toilet facilities?
Right. I mean, now like 500 people share one toilet kind of situation. So I think immediately there has to be field hospitals, first of all, to replace the hospitals that have been destroyed. And I should mention that Jordan set up a field hospital and the Israeli military did bomb it. So they have to stop doing things like that, which is a war crime, by the way. You're never, ever allowed to bomb hospitals. So we have to have some kind of temporary medical system set up, probably field hospitals. And then we have to have adequate, just even start with tents. I mean, for some people, moving into a tent would be a step up. And then we have to have immense amounts of food coming in because farmers aren't harvesting their crops. The crops have been bombed. The soil is poisoned. The water is poisoned. So just basic feeding people, keeping them warm through the winter. I mean, I've been in Gaza in January. It is miserable, it's cold, it's wet. You do not want to be sleeping in the rubble. So just that kind of basic stuff has to happen. I think that there is such an immense amount of trauma that people will not even begin to be able to address their trauma until they feel safe. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a sense of safety. Mm-hmm. That is sort of the short-term stuff. You also have to remember that 50% of the 2.3 million people are under 18. Mm-hmm. So the whole educational system has fallen apart. Kids need to be in school. They need to have some structure in their lives. So that would mean that UNRWA, who just got temporarily, hopefully defunded by some major givers, is funded and funded adequately and able to start up the schools, find the teachers. I mean, they don't even know where staff is located anymore because everybody's scattered. So that kind of basic stuff has to happen. And people need employment. So the question is, would people be employed in the rebuilding of Gaza? And then in the sort of medium term, you've got to get housing that's actual housing and not tents. You've got to rebuild the universities. You've got to rebuild the hospitals. And then,
but those are long-term projects.
Those are long-term. But that's medium-term in this conversation.
Yeah.
Because the long-term is that the siege has to end, that there has to be, that this is a human rights struggle, and that until Palestinians are treated as equal human beings to their Jewish neighbors, this is not going to get better. So
that means the international community has to insist that Palestinians have a right to exist.
Exactly.
In Palestine. Have
an equal right to exist.
Yes.
Yes. And that's the big picture. And just one last thing, the powers that be are talking about who's going to run Gaza and will the Palestinian Authority take over Gaza? These are questions that the Gazans need to decide.
Yes.
So we have a sort of very colonial approach towards fixing this, and ultimately the Gazans need to figure out what they want. And so there has to be a construction that involves the people who are living there and how they want to live and who they want to govern them. And I think that that's really missing in the conversation now. And so it's just a perpetuation of the colonial powers deciding what the poor natives need this week, and I think that kind of attitude has proven catastrophic repeatedly in world history, and I just hope it doesn't get repeated again this time.
My wife and daughter often accuse me of yelling at the TV, and they remind me they can't hear you. But it is my reaction, my visceral reaction when I hear ridiculous things like them talking about who's going to control Gaza, and they're speaking of the Palestinian people as objects with no agency.
Or children.
Yes.
Misbehaved children.
And there is the sense that, okay, well, Israel's going to be armed to the teeth, per capita, the most militarized society in the world, but that the Palestinians can only exist in a demilitarized capacity. It reeks with the scent of the black codes in this country, where African Americans, it was against the law for them to ride a horse because then they can get away. We want to make sure you're on foot. We can chase you down on horse with dogs. And then you couldn't read, but you also couldn't own a gun, because then whites could come into your home, your neighborhood at any time, and they never had to fear looking down the nozzle of a gun. But we spent every day of our life looking down the barrel of white folks' guns. So white folks were only comfortable when we were defenseless. And so setting up a situation where who would accept a peace that says you have to remain defenseless? I'm not comfortable if you can defend yourself, but you have to accept the fact that I can blow you to smithereens and coming to you anytime I want to. Again, it is undergirded with the mentality that the Palestinians are not people, because no people would accept that deal that doesn't acknowledge their humanity and their right to be safe, because that's not safe. Sabrina, you want to?
Yeah, I get, you gave me permission before we started here to come as I am, so I'm going to be authentic in this answer.
Do you?
Because, thank you. Because we have an example of what a self-governing Palestinian state looks like, right? Self-governing, quote unquote, in the West Bank. And it is, I think, one of the biggest scams that has happened in like recent times, because Israel is in control at every corner. Yes. When you're talking about a territory that is self-governing, why would you have checkpoints with, like, to make somebody's, let's say their commute to work, a 30-minute commute, you will make it 3 hours because of the amount of checkpoints that you have that has armed soldiers pointing it at every car that comes through, every child that has to make it to school. That's not a self-governing territory, right? Why are there Israeli military individuals walking through the streets of Palestine? If you are truly saying that you are going to give Palestine self-governance, then you need to leave Palestine. You need to leave the territory as it is. Now, how do you do that when you have settlements set up in the middle of Palestinian territory? Hamas isn't in the West Bank. So again, when we're talking about this, the fake peace deals that have been offered to the Palestinians, there's no level of authenticity to it. There's no level of transparency to it, and there's no truth to it. While they were sitting there talking about a peace deal, they were building settlements on Palestinian stolen land. They were kicking Palestinians out of their homes. To this day, they're arming settlers, not people who do not serve in the Israeli army. They are handing them weapons to defend themselves against Palestinians in the West Bank. It is the level of hypocrisy in this scenario is unreal.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Rothschild. The Israelis would say the checkpoints are necessary for Israel to feel safe, for their security, and that the settlements are a buffer. And so the last U.S. president to talk definitively about the problem of Jewish settlements in Palestinian territories was George H.W. Bush, and the backlash from the Jewish lobby in this country was so fierce.
The Israel lobby, not the Jewish lobby.
Israel lobby. He quickly backtracked. So is America, is the United States, what needs to happen to have the conversation here to put pressure on the Israeli government? Because I don't have the sense that the Israeli government, and you know the nuances and so forth and that better than I, that they have any sense of doing anything just toward the Palestinian people.
All right, can I just say something before you answer?
Yes, go ahead.
I want to set up the stage because I realize that maybe a lot of the folks in the audience don't understand what the settlements are and what the checkpoints are. So I'm going to set the stage in something I think that we're all pretty familiar with, which is the Northwest. So just for example, Seattle being the West Bank, I think that argument of Israel defending itself in the sense of safety that they have by having settlements and checkpoints to ensure their safety and as a buffer would make sense if the settlements were in Linwood, Issaquah, Kent, Vashon, right? Because then they would be surrounding the city of Seattle. What is actually happening is settlements are built in Capitol Hill, they're built in UW, they're built in Ballard, they're built in Lower Queen Anne, and checkpoints all throughout Seattle. So when you're going from Northgate, for example, down to, let's say, Columbia City, instead of it taking you the 35 minutes that it normally takes, it now could take you all day because you could be held at a checkpoint. So it's actually not, that's also actually a lie that these checkpoints and these settlements actually help Israel's safety. They're actually another means of control and surveillance and land grab. That's actually what they serve as. So I just wanted to set the record straight on what that actually looks like.
I think that allows people to get a mental picture.
Right.
That's helpful.
And I think one of the problems is that Jewish safety in Israel is supposed to be based on Palestinian suffering and Palestinian suppression. And the idea that if you suppress people long enough, they will rebel and not accept their situation doesn't seem to be part of the Israeli psyche. And so a lot of people talk about this attack on October 7th as if it started on October 7th. Mm-hmm. This is 75 years of oppression that erupted on October 7th. And I'm not saying this to excuse it, but I think it's very important to understand it, that people who are oppressed will fight their oppression. And if Israeli Jews want to be safe, then they have to treat their neighbors with dignity and respect, because that's how you build safety, not by, as there's a horrible expression of the Israeli attacks in Gaza every year or 2 or 3, they call it mowing the lawn. That is no way to be safe by oppressing another people. And
mowing the lawn?
That's the expression. So, it's just horrifying to think about. So that formulation then leads to behaviors that only make Israeli Jews more unsafe, and then they are more afraid because they are actually unsafe because of the oppressive behaviors that their military and their government are doing. So, right now, the sort of mood in the Israeli state is one of great fear. People are just devastated over the people who died. They're horrified that the hostages haven't been released yet. The country is completely traumatized. But the response is, we got to kill all those Palestinians, not why would people do something like this, and what role did we have in creating this level of rage? And so that's a kind of insight that is not prevalent in Israeli society at this moment. And then you have this incredibly right-wing government that's really revving people up in the most racist, hideous, genocidal ways, and you can see that the direction is just going in the wrong direction. So that's why Israel is not going to save itself. It needs pressure from the international world, and one of the ways to do that is not to have unconditional military funding for Israel, and to respect the boycott, divestment, sanction campaign, which started in 2005 out of a group of civil society Palestinian organizations. It's a nonviolent resistance movement. When that started, everybody was up in arms. And I was like, wait a minute, Palestinians aren't allowed to resist violently, and they're not allowed to resist nonviolently. So how exactly are they supposed to resist? And so people need to think a lot about that, and think about how the international community contributes with political cover, with money. And then I think the other thing to think about is that there is a multi-million dollar industry of controlling the narrative. So it comes out of the Israeli government. They actually have like a bureau, I don't remember the exact name, that its job is to control the narrative internationally on Israel. And then there are a whole bunch of groups in this country that do that, that attack people if they have criticisms of Israeli policy. And the main way to attack is by accusing someone of being an anti-Semite. So there's been a weaponization of anti-Semitism, and it's very problematic because the current definition that the State Department uses for anti-Semitism involves criticism of Israel. And I would argue that that is really, really, really inappropriate. You know, anti-Semitism exists. It's rising in this country, along with, white nationalism and hatred of people of color and LGBTQI and women in general and all sorts of people who are not armed white men. And so we have to really keep anti-Semitism in the right compartment. But criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic. Israel is a state, it's not a religion. And so that using that weaponization, you will, once you hear about it, you'll see it all the time. And it really shuts people up because nobody wants to be an anti-Semite. And so that's a way to control the narrative, and that Israel is always the victim, always the good guy. Think about the name of the army is the Israel Defense Force. They only defend themselves when, in fact, and I grew up thinking that the quote was, the Israeli Defense Force is the most moral army in the world, and I was so proud of them, It's a myth, and so I think we have to look at the myths that were created around the founding of Israel and the myths that are perpetuated.
My grandmama used to say, you don't need an education to know when something's foul, mm-hmm. and when it's not. And when we look on TV, we can see merciless killing and death and destruction. As a Jewish individual, what conversations do you have within your community about this? Are people bothered by it? Is there, I'm sure Jewish people are no more a monolith than any people. So you got different perspectives of it. But how do you frame your conversation within your community about people? Is this okay with us? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and not only is the Jewish community not monolithic, it's pretty fractured at this point. And so in certain segments of the Jewish community, particularly the younger generations, there's a tremendous amount of support for Palestine. And if you look at the demonstrations that have been going on in this country, many of them are organized by Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, which are basically Jewish people, skewing to the younger age group. If you get into the mainstream Jewish community, then things really begin to fall apart because the Jewish community tends to be very liberal on social issues, mm-hmm. But it tends also to be, progressive, accept Palestine. So then you have sort of agonized liberal Jews who are very, very uncomfortable and really hate Netanyahu and really are worried about the fate of Israel because they love the country, but they can't stand the direction it's going in. And then you have more right-wing Jews, many in the Republican Party, who are cheering Israel on and think that, a very nationalistic, militarized country that is ready to fight Iran and do all sorts of, things against Muslims is our kind of country. So the community is very fractured. I personally am not talking a lot with people who are in those camps. My community is the progressive community, so I'm out on the streets with my buddies calling for a ceasefire in a crowd of people who are all calling for a ceasefire.
What do you want to see people like myself doing? What would you urge us to do in this fight? Because I really do believe that how America leans on Israel is going to have more to do with the direction that it takes toward the Palestinian people and the whole pursuit of peace, defining what it is and those things, than necessarily coming from within solely. What do you want us to do?
Should I answer?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, both of you, I'd like to see.
So, I mean, the first thing you need to do is to be educated, because if you just go on social media and listen to some mainstream news, you will have not a clue as to what's going on. So getting yourself educated and then educating your community is absolutely critical. You know, people form opinions mostly not intellectually, they form it from emotional attachment ties. They love someone who has this feeling, so they join in that feeling. So self-education and community education is critical. I think then the next responsibility we have is that we have to keep pressuring our public elected officials. Unfortunately, the only way that we're going to make any difference in terms of this total support of Israel with complete impunity to do whatever they want to do is by changing our public officials. So, you know, you should be calling everyone who has a position of power in Washington every day and giving them a piece of your mind and signing every petition and organizing your religious faith organizations to make statements. I mean, this amazing ad just came out in the New York Times, Rabbis for a Ceasefire. And there's this whole long list of Jewish rabbis who are calling for a ceasefire, who are calling out genocide, who are naming really what's going on. That takes bravery, it takes money, it takes organizing. All of that stuff is really, really important. And then I think we have to be out in the streets demonstrating. I mean, people were so upset that, you know, a group including my daughter shut down I-5 a couple of weeks ago. But I felt like, you feel inconvenienced? Imagine being, you know, a young woman in Gaza who is starving and has 3 kids and is living in a tent and is hungry and cold. You know how inconvenienced she feels? We need to wake up, and we need to feel uncomfortable, and we need to act on that. So I think protesting, joining in notifying your public officials and staying educated are the ways to do this. And honoring the boycott is another way.
Sabrina?
I think that you hit on all of what I wrote down. I wrote, learn and educate yourself, educate others, advocate in all sectors, definitely the political sector being the top one. I think that we see a huge disconnect in what our public officials are calling for and what the people are calling for. So I would just think that let's help fix that disconnect by letting them know, as you stated earlier, how we feel and what we want from them. At the end of the day, they work for us, right? So there are some advocacy days coming up in Olympia. I would strongly encourage you all to attend, show support. I believe there's JVP is holding one. I'm in a group that's holding one on February 20th. So that's a good opportunity to come down to Olympia and definitely let your state legislators know that you're not okay with a genocide happening in front of your eyes. I wanted to also flag that you talked about rabbis for peace, was it? In the
Rabbis
New York
for a
Times?
ceasefire.
Rabbis for ceasefire. There was also I think a letter that was signed by, I want to say over 1,000 Black
Pastors, right?
pastors, yes, that went to Biden to call for a ceasefire. So we are seeing definitely the interfaith community is coming up really strong for this. We have really strong interfaith ties here in the Northwest, so I would recommend, finding our interfaith networks to connect with and learn from one another. I was sharing earlier that some of the safest places I find are interfaith spaces because I think that a lot of us understand centering humanity and can understand that watching people be mass murdered is probably against most of our religions. And so I think that I would really strongly encourage you all to do that once you really learn and educate yourselves. I think, we talk a lot about like reputable sources or finding the right source to get your news from. But I think right now, I would urge you to look for Palestinian voices, because that's where you're going to get the most accurate information of what's happening in Palestine. Many of us have families there. Many of us have lost family members in Gaza. There is a lot happening in the West Bank. Palestinians in the West Bank are not safe. They're not safe to go to school. They're not safe to go to work. So there's a lot happening. I would urge you to find Palestinians who are reporting live from Gaza, or Palestinians who are sharing and circulating videos here locally. So yeah, that's what I would say.
And in terms of sources, there's Electronic Intifada, there's Al Jazeera. I would also recommend this group that I work with, We Are Not Numbers. So their website is wearenotnumbers.org, where we have young people reporting what their lives are like every day. And it's a really good way to ground yourself in the realities for Palestinians.
I'm going to ask both of you if you would send me via email those sources that you named, and then we will put those out there, make them available to people so that they can follow up on that, because they want to be knowledgeable. We see so much misinformation. So one of the downsides of social media is that there is so much misinformation, and sometimes all people have to do is just muddy the waters to defeat you, because then you don't know what's what. And certainly that will help us. I want to thank the both of you for coming out again, and I don't sense this will be our last conversation, because we need to keep going with this. The war is going on, and when the war is over, the issue still goes on. The issue has not been resolved. How are these two peoples going to live in a negotiated peace and arrangement and boundaries and all of those kinds of things, and defense and trade and embargoes and stopping them and pulling down checkpoints and settlements and all of that, and international players? There's so much to be sorted out. It hurts me to my heart that my nation is very much a part of the problem, that my tax dollars are literally going to support the slaughter of a people. And as a person who is very historically minded, to see that our nation's narrative is filled with slaughter that was justified and rationalized, filled with slaughter internally of peoples, and to see much of the language and the behavior that we've done from within, we're just mirroring it in terms of what we see in terms of colonialistic behavior externally. It hurts me to my heart to see what is going on. We are your friends, your advocates. Do not hesitate to call us and help us, let us be partners in anything that you are doing. We will reach out to you as well. I think we have to lock arms to at least try to make this world a better place.
It's also very dangerous. If we look at, the U.S. has now bombed, there's fighting now in Syria, Iraq, Iran's proxies, Lebanon. This is now an area of the world that's about to potentially explode. And it's going to be incredibly dangerous for everybody.
I just so that we don't end on too negative note, because I still have to eat dinner and I want to be able to digest it. I've said to many people with our own internal presidential election coming up and down ticket issues, our elections of late tend to bring out the worst in us, particularly because some of the characters running and their loose handle on the truth. I think the worst in the American spirit is going to come out over this fight for control over this country and what kind of country it's going to be. And so I'm bracing for that and what we will be dealing with going into 2025. So with that, and then looking at how many nations could be pulled in, who are already pulled in proxy, but could be pulled in to a Middle East situation that explodes, and infinite players becoming involved, the economic implications, supply chain, all of that. If this thing gets totally out of hand, and there is no sense that anyone is in control of this. It's just random forces, and people's genuflection tends to be toward being more aggressive than the other force. So as a man of faith, I pray to God every day saying, God, this is a God moment, because we humans have created a situation that we don't know how to fix. So we need you to come in ways we can't explain. We just know that you got us out of the mess that we're in. This is by whatever name we know God, however we know God. We need to be calling on God to save us from ourselves. Because I have hope because I believe in God, but I am terrified at what I think people are on the verge of doing and are doing. That said, can both of you give me at least one thing that you see as positive that is developing in all this? Have you seen anything positive that gives you hope that the absolute worst might not come to pass?
Well, for me, having been in this struggle for 25 years and knowing the history beyond that, the thing that gives me hope is that what's happening now is no longer invisible. I mean, there have been huge numbers of horrific things that have happened between Israel and Palestine, and this is the one that has been most visible. So we see that now the struggle for justice for Palestinians is now a global struggle. And you look at countries all over the world, people know where Palestine is, they know there's a fight, they know what the issues are, and I think that that's a totally different situation than has been for many, many, many decades. So I think that that's good, that it's now reached a level that it's a global issue of justice, and it's the civil rights issue and the anti-racism issue for the world.
Quickly, does Netanyahu get reelected?
Does he get reelected? And no, he's going to fall as soon as the war ends, and then hopefully he'll get indicted and go to jail, which is why he doesn't want to stop the war. But the question is, who will replace him? And there are no good options right now, so
we may go from the fire to the frying pan.
Yeah, it may be Netanyahu heavy or Netanyahu light, but it's not going to be some visionary justice-seeking leader, I can guarantee you.
So we're not going to go from a pick W Bota to a de Klerk, like in South Africa. Okay. Sabrina, one thing positive that gives you hope?
I think Dr. Alice and I are, we are from the same handbook, because I think I would just keep echoing every answer that she's already given, unfortunately. But, I think for me personally, this is going to sound so ridiculous, but when all of this started in October, I didn't post on my social medias. I think I had a lot going on that I was physically doing with, folks here locally in Seattle to advocate for Palestine. But every single one of my friends was posting on their social medias. And I think that the screaming in the corner, I felt like me and my family were screaming alone in this corner in Seattle for so long by ourselves. Maybe not by ourselves, that's a little bit extreme, but like you just mentioned, there wasn't a lot of light shed on what was happening, and I feel like I don't have to scream in the corner alone anymore. The 20 plus years of Palestinian advocacy I've done has made its reach, and I think really what unfortunately it's like the saddest thing to say, but the heroes in Gaza that are risking their lives to document really what's happening is what's going to come back and bite Israel in the long run, because they can't hide from video documentation of their atrocities. So it's not really a positive thing, unfortunately. It's a kind of a horrific thing, but I'm hoping that long term, the generations of Palestinians to come will be free.
The final stanza in the what was formerly called the Negro National Anthem, now we call it the Negro National Hymn in this country, written by Johnson, who was an agnostic, but he realized black people generally writ large were religious. But he said, stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading a path through the blood of the slaughtered, out from the gloomy pass to where we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is Cass. And, you know, it is an acknowledgement that the road we've traveled has been god-awful. There are lots of peoples in the world who the way they've had to come has been god-awful. And the heroes are the people who pushed for life even when they were dying. To me, those are the real heroes. We have to fight for them. You know, there's an old spiritual say, we have to fight although we have to cry. Mm-hmm. And so we fight for them, and we lift up their voices. And hopefully we can make this world a little bit better place. Thank you for coming. I look forward to when we will meet again. You guys make for a good tandem here. I like the chemistry here. So I want to thank Dr. Alice Rothschild and Sabrina O'Day for coming and giving us updates on the Palestine-Israel situation, the war, the humanitarian crisis, the international policy issues are related to that, and all related matters. We look forward to continuing to get updates from them periodically, because this is not a quick fix. See you next week, same time, same bat channel. Take care of your health, take care of your loved ones, and peace and love.
Thank you for joining Conversations with the Pastor here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Listen, you can also join us for church service on Sunday mornings at 9:30 a.m. You're not going to want to miss this one. See you next week.